Good morning, Judson, and welcome to chapel. I am excited to tackle today's question, which is it bad to deconstruct your faith? You'll notice we did not begin with any musical worship. It's because we thought this question was a big enough question, it was a significant enough question that we wanted to dedicate more real estate to it. And so I'd like to begin our time together with a story. Let me tell you a story. Even though he was born in the working class, he never felt the disadvantage his race brought with him, but he was keenly aware that he was different. Early on in his life, he was adopted by an extremely wealthy family who had all the access that power and privilege could afford them. He was personally tutored by the best of the best in the nation and learned about the family business and never felt lack. He wasn't being groomed to take over the family business. He was being groomed to kind of be a vice president, but he knew that he had a powerful and strong destiny. As he grew older, he began to see that the family business was deeply exploitative. It relied on unjust working conditions, coercion, and it was all undergirded with this theology of more is better and God is on our side and we are here to do the work of God, so let's make more. And for a long time, he was able to suppress the questions. He ignored the racial dynamics and he just kept moving forward. But one day, he came face to face with his own complicity in the system. And he couldn't stomach what his adoptive family was doing. And he couldn't go backwards, he couldn't forget, he couldn't paper over, and he could not pretend like everything was fine. It just wasn't right. He saw what his family was doing to his people. And so he ran. He sought to get away from dad and the whole family system, and he moved far away from his father's reach, cut off from all communication, and there, in what you could only call the desert place, he sought to rebuild his life. But this process of rebuilding demanded some element of deconstructing what he believed, what he was raised with. And he had these deep theological complicity questions to wrestle with. Was everything I believed about God a lie? Was everything my family taught me a lie? Was everything, is anything from this theological system even salvageable? Is God really that cruel to people who look like me? He deconstructed for decades. Over the last several years, folks have begun tossing around a number of different verbiage to describe a process of deconstruction. And so you have things like doubt, questions, deconstruction, destruction, reconstruction, and then evangelical, post-evangelical, ex-evangelical, post-Christian, and they're all kind of trying to get at a conversation that's happening inside and outside of the church about what to do with our faith when things do not quite add up, when we are not sure that we want to carry forward what we've been handed. And this process is perhaps described quite well by Melanie Mudd. She describes deconstruction like this. She says that deconstruction, it goes beyond questions and doubt, and it is the taking apart of an idea, practice, tradition, belief, or system, and breaking it down into smaller components in order to examine their foundation, their truthfulness, their usefulness, and their impact. Author Rachel Held Evans, she phrases deconstruction like this. She says, it's like taking a massive inventory of your faith, tearing every doctrine from the cupboard, and turning each one over in your hand. You see, deconstruction goes beyond just simple questions and doubts, because for deconstructionists, it's the stage after questions and doubts. Questions and doubts just kind of get you going, but deconstruction actually gets you excavating what you truly believe. And on the other side of that, whether that's destruction, whether that's reconstruction, whether that's devolving your faith into nothing or feeling a sense of evolution, there's a whole list of options for things that you kind of transform into. You pick up some kind of a belief system somewhere. The common metaphor that's used is to think about this process of deconstruction like a house. It looks great on the outside, but the closer you get to it, you realize there's issues with the foundation. There's whole parts of the exterior that are actually missing. The floors need to be redone, and there's holes in the ceiling, and you're not quite sure where that smell is coming from. The only real way forward, the only real way to make this house livable and salvageable is to do a complete top to bottom, floor to ceiling, wall to wall, outside to inside renovation, a complete gut, tear it all out because it needs to be replaced with something brand new. The old will not do anymore. And so what does some of this process look like? Well, here is a firsthand account from a former senior editor at a Christian publication. Andre Henry writes, he says, I was surprised and disillusioned to see the level of Christian apathy and antipathy in response to the movement for Black lives. To be told that social justice is not part of the gospel. Worse, I was demoralized to witness the overwhelming evangelical support for Donald Trump, a candidate praised by the nation's most overt white nationalists. I tried to reason with my evangelical siblings until it became clear that the institutions were not likely to change. Had they listened, I might still be an evangelical Christian today. For some of us, we hear this quote and we feel a sense of defensiveness rise up within us. Because we feel like our person, our system is being targeted by something like what Andre Henry is writing about. But I want to ask you to just hold his story for a moment and just kind of sit with it for a second. For Andre, his journey of deconstruction started because of evangelical apathy and antipathy, he says, towards social justice, towards how evangelicals were engaging in politics at the time. And I don't think his story is uncommon. In fact, I think his story is quite common. Some of the most frequent reasons that people cite their deconstruction journey, the reasons they cite that they go from deconstruction to deconversion or anything in between, dealing with Christianity, here's just a handful of them. Some of the reasons are how Christians allied themselves with specific candidates or took up specific political causes and then deployed the Bible to justify both the ends and the means, whatever the cost. It's questions about LGBTQ inclusion. It's questions and reflections on the harm done by purity culture and what your body and your sexuality have to do with each other, and if both of those things are bad. Care or lack of care on the topic of race and ethnicity, and how churches or organizations responded in 2014, 16, 18, 2020, 2021, and today. It's personal hurt or religious trauma. It's experiencing or seeing spiritual abuse or gross pastoral malpractice. It's witnessing leadership failure after leadership failure after leadership failure after leadership failure when you can drive to some of those places in less than 15 minutes from here. And all of these things have an entire generation wondering, is the foundation of this whole thing rotten? Do we need to get rid of this whole thing to build something brand new? Like it's on us, or is it even worth saving? Some would say no. The movement, the church, Christianity itself, it's too polluted, it's too corrupt, it's too stained with the sins that we've inherited, with the injustice that we've inherited. And so in order to salvage anything, what's needed is complete destruction. We need to raze it to the ground, down to the most atomistic doctrine, a complete rereading of the scriptures, a rediscovery of a new Jesus for a new era, for a new kind of people, a new understanding of the church. Everything has to be rewound and redone. Now, deconstructionists would be the first to tell you that this is not an easy process. This is, in fact, a very painful process. It's a heart-wrenching process. For many, it involves leaving communities behind. It involves losing friendships, breaking up with churches. So we're not stereotyping this crew. And in fact, the reason we're giving this much real estate, an entire chapel, to just this question and why it's just me up here is because I want to be keenly aware that we are not creating straw man or straw woman arguments about a community that's asking genuine questions about the church and Jesus, because theologically, philosophically, I believe to create a straw man argument of the deconstructionist movement is to lie to you. And so we're not stereotyping this crew. They're not deconstructing because they want to be cool or because it's the sexy thing to do. Now, I believe that there is a significant element of isolated virtual peer pressure, but the overall process is extremely painful and difficult, and there are some of you in this room that know exactly what I'm talking about. You've been through this process. You know what it's like. Now, Andre's deconstruction journey led him to entirely leave evangelicalism in favor for a more progressive, or what he'd call an open faith. And there's a temptation here to only treat deconstruction as if it's something that pulls people towards progressivism and liberal theology. But there is a conservative and theologically liberal version of this. And this is how I know, I guarantee I am walking out of here with everybody is going to be friends with me. Because I don't think actually any of us come away from this unscathed. The drift for progressives is to completely demo the outside and inside of their theological house. I'd argue that they'd be gutting many of the beautiful and crucial things that we've inherited from the historical and global church. And they start rereading the scriptures in a way that affirms all the things we already believe about sexuality, power, wealth. It's a reworking of our understanding of God so it's compatible, I'd argue, with secular utopianism. That we are, with whether God is coming with us or not, we are building a utopia. Are you on board? And the problem with some of that kind of deconstruction is you start the process and you don't quite know where to end. And here's how pastor's kid turned humanist chaplain Bart Campolo describes his theological journey on a recent podcast. He says of himself, because once you start adjusting your theology to match up to the reality you see in front of you, it's an infinite progression. So over the course of the next 30 years, my ability to believe in a supernatural narrative or a God who intervenes and does anything died a death of 1,000 unanswered prayers. I passed through every stage of heresy. It starts out with sovereignty, and then biblical authority goes, and then I'm a universalist, now I'm marrying gay people, and pretty soon I don't actually believe Jesus rose from the dead in a bodily way. And I think he captures what I think is some of the danger of deconstruction if it's not done well. I mean, once you get to deconstruct one part of orthodoxy, where do you stop? Later in the interview, Bart says that even deconstructing orthodoxy, it becomes kind of this exciting new habit that you do. I mean, when we have only one hammer, everything looks like it's a nail. Every problem, every issue requires some kind of deconstruction rather than some kind of formation. Now, the drift for conservatives is towards fundamentalism. The deconstruction drift for conservatives is towards fundamentalism, where in the face of these kinds of questions, we know our internal bodily system goes on high alert and we feel danger, danger, danger. And so what we do is clamp down harder on our beliefs. We may not make any kind of a concerted effort to listen to those outside of our camp. We may not even bother listening to those podcasts that kind of trigger us. And so if we stick with the image of a house, instead of gutting it like our progressive brothers and sisters do, what we do is we reinforce our house without inspection. It doesn't matter. Let's cake everything in cement. We put up barbed wire. We make our position absolutely unassailable. We pepper the yard with landmines and search for truth at all costs. We are, in our inner disposition, we are confrontational, protective, reactive, myopic. And so if anybody has anything to say against our guy or our woman, our favorite church or pastor, our interpretation of the Bible, man, they're going to be sorry because I'm just going to skewer them. And while we believe we've perfected our theology, we are deeply deficient in practicing and feeling our theology appropriately. Because true Christian theology is not about theology alone, but Christ alone. So, spoiler alert, the answer to our question of the day, if we return back to our question, is it bad to deconstruct our faith? The answer is no. It is not bad to deconstruct our faith. And in fact, I'm going to argue that Jesus teaches us how to deconstruct. He shows us that there is a good kind of deconstruction, that there are things we absolutely, without question, should peel away from our faith because it is harmful and it is terrible to have it married in with the gospel of Jesus. And so our text is going to come from Matthew 23. Matthew 23, starting in verse 2. Jesus says, I took out the quotes, so I know what I'm saying now. Jesus says, the scribes and the Pharisees are seated in the chair of Moses, the place of honor in the synagogue. That's where you would sit. The chair of Moses would essentially be like if President Gene Kroom sat in a chair behind me to watch me teaching you. It'd be terrifying, but he'd be the place of honor. And some of you are like, that's what we should do. We should keep Chris on a leash. And I'm like, you're not wrong. So we keep going in verse 3. Therefore, Jesus says, do whatever they tell you and observe it. But don't do what they do, because they don't practice what they teach. They tie up heavy loads that are hard to carry and put them on people's shoulders, but they themselves aren't willing to lift a finger to move them. Now, to get the gravity of this scene, you have to understand a few things about what's going on here. The first thing is that Jesus is saying this right in front of the Pharisees and the scribes. Like, this is out in the open. They're literally right there. They just got done having a conversation with Jesus, and then Jesus turns to his followers right here, and he goes, these people are terrible. He's not subtweeting them. He's not posting on his own channel. He is standing right in front of them and putting them on notice to their faces. Secondly, We have to understand a little bit about who the Pharisees were. Christians love to pummel the Pharisees, and for a pretty good reason. I'm not actually opposed to that. But Jesus actually consistently drags the Pharisees in front of the crowds. And some of the reasons we'll talk about right now. They believed in a loving God who gave the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, and believed that God invited his people into eternal life. That actually sounds pretty similar and familiar to Jesus' own teaching. In fact, some scholars believe that Jesus was a Pharisee by training, and he's actually critiquing his own crowd. And what's so startling about this scene is that the Pharisees are actually really popular among the people. They were like the working class pastors. They were the pastors who were actually around. They weren't locked away in the halls of power. They were here among the people trying to solve a crucial theological question of the day. And the theological question of the day is, why are the Romans here and why are the Romans oppressing us? God told us that if we were faithful to the covenant, we would not be living in this kind of oppression. So what do we do? And the Pharisees show up and they say, I actually have an answer to that. And the people loved that they had an answer because they couldn't find an answer. And so what the Pharisees say is they say, well, the problem is, the reason the Romans are here is because we are not actually being faithful enough to the covenant. We are not keeping the covenant strongly enough. So I think we are doing a whole ton of things to accidentally break the covenant, and God's getting secretly mad at us. And so he's punishing us with the Romans. And so let's, instead of just having the rules themselves, let's build a 10-foot moat around the rules so that none of us can even get close to breaking any of the rules. They added a lot of extra rules to the Torah to accommodate this cultural question because they wanted to be sure they were not even getting close to breaking the law. They wanted out of Roman rule. They fundamentally wanted to liberate their people, and so they created a system of theology and practice that was hyper-faithfulness. And Jesus actually says they're right on some things, but they are deeply, deeply wrong in others. And Jesus is having none of it. So watch him go off in a couple verses later in verse 13. In fact, this is a whole chapter, so if you want to watch the roast, go for it. But we're going to skip down to verse 13. Jesus says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites," or you're two-faced. "You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. For you don't go in and you don't allow those entering to go in." Like, you don't even allow those who want to go through the door to go in. You shut it in people's faces for everyone except for you. Verse 15, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you are hypocrites. You travel over land and sea to make one convert, and when he becomes one, you make him as much a child of hell as you are." That is pretty savage. That is pretty savage. Imagine having Jesus tell you that. You don't really recover. "Woe to you," verse 23, "scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. You pay a tenth of mint, dill, and cumin, and yet you have neglected the more important matters of the law." Now, Jesus is getting at the absurdity. Like, imagine you making ramen in your home or wherever, like the crappy ramen, not like the good ramen, but like, the stuff that you're hungry after. That you have add things to, you know what I'm talking about? You know exactly what I'm talking about. That's all we can afford. Okay, so imagine you're making that kind of ramen, and you want to be so faithful to God and his covenant. You take a little bit of the chicken stock, because that's the only kind of ramen that's worth it. Take a little bit of the chicken stock and you take 10%. You measure it out. You take 10%, put it in a bowl, put that to the side. And then you take 10% of whatever extra spices you're adding in. Red pepper flakes, there's a secret life hack for you. And then you put that to the side. You take 10% of every can of tuna. It's actually really good. And you add that, but you take 10% out and you put that in a bowl and you put that to the side. And then you take 10% of the noodles themselves. You cut off 10% and you put that in a bowl to the side. And then you take all of these bowls and you go to the church and you say, "Here is my tithe. See how faithful I am. I tithed even my spices." It's absurd. It's ridiculous. And Jesus says, "Yet you have neglected the more important matters of the law." For all of the posturing, the virtue signaling that you're doing, you have neglected the more important matters of the law, which is justice, mercy, and faithfulness. These things, Jesus says, should have been done without neglecting the others. And then he calls them blind guides. This is a brutal passage, and imagine being there. It's very awkward. It's tremendously awkward. You're just like standing. You ever stood where someone's getting in the middle of an argument, and you're like, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be doing right. Am I supposed to come to is Jesus? He seems like he's doing okay. Are the Pharisees? You're like, okay, this is just a brutal scene to witness and to have Matthew record. And this is just part of this chapter as a whole. Jesus actually targets 7 of these right in a row. And he targets the Pharisees. He says that their public presence is corrupt. The way that they teach is polluted. Their evangelism and spiritual formation has serious problems with it. They have made false promises. They have a greed problem. That despite their strict rules, they are lawless because they are making up their own laws. Their belief, he targets that the Pharisees believe that they would not have done any of the evil from their ancestors. This is what C.S. Lewis calls chronological snobbery. And so the Pharisees were essentially saying, oh, I would have been above that. I am not a product of my culture and my time. I would have been above those peons that did terrible things in the past. And Jesus says that is completely wrong. You would have absolutely been there. And it all pivots around the idea that the Pharisees have actually missed the whole point. The Pharisees think that they are good, but Jesus points out they've neglected the actual point of their faith. And Jesus boils it down like this. This is what's required. This is the non-negotiable of the faith. It is to practice justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Now, don't miss that this is a type of deconstruction. Jesus is deconstructing the Pharisees' practice. He's exposing the rottenness in their system, the parts that need to be removed because they've missed the main point of it all. And they need to sit with justice, mercy, and faithfulness. And Jesus is doing a specific kind of deconstruction. He's actually using and pulling from the biblical witness to critique the Pharisees. Justice, mercy, and faithfulness echoes the very things that the prophets would critique Israel for. And so Jesus is not just saying, you are missing these 3 random things. He's saying, do you know who you are in the story? You are actually wayward Israel that's being confronted by a prophet that wants to call you back to the covenant, loving relationship with God, but you have missed it because you have missed justice, mercy, and faithfulness. He doesn't critique the Pharisees with Roman culture or Pharisee culture. He critiques the Pharisees with the very words of Scripture. And he says that they've missed it. Pastor and author John Mark Comer says it like this. There is a kind of deconstruction where Jesus uses Scripture to critique the world's corruption, or in our case, the Pharisees' corruption of the church. But the Western millennial type of deconstruction uses the world to critique Scripture's authority over the church, and the former is the way of Jesus. You see, for the last 2,000 plus years, and we could argue it extends far beyond that with the way that Jesus is handling the Pharisees. For the last 2,000 plus years, and across the historic Christian church, we have inherited this legacy of 3 orthos. 3 orthos. Let me explain. The first is we have orthodoxy. We have orthodoxy. Ortho meaning right, doxa, which is the Greek words for this, doxa meaning belief. So right belief. We have orthodoxy or right belief. And this is just a collection of ideas that has been passed down from the time of Jesus about how to think and live like Jesus, about how to believe and have the same kind of faith that Jesus had, the same kind of loving, joy-filled relationship with the Father and communion with the Spirit. And so Christianity is connected to this legacy that reaches back thousands of years and builds off the scriptural and theological reflection off of every major continent on the planet. And right belief is this idea that there are some theological non-negotiables. There are plenty of open-handed issues and topics and questions that we can all be in fellowship over, even though we have strong and profound disagreements. But there are some things that are closed-handed issues for the Christian church. And we benefit from that legacy that's been passed down for centuries. And that means even in our deconstruction, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We have writings from ancient men and women who wrestled with the same question their whole lives. And instead of feeling the pressure to have this all solved in a year or 2 years or 6 months or after you watched a video, these ancient men and women wrestled with these kinds of questions their entire lives in community, with theological reflection and scriptural fidelity. And we get to learn from it. We get to benefit from it. And some students have asked me, what's the point in reading all these kinds of books? And I'm telling you, this is it. It's getting to benefit from the best that the men and women who have gone before you have to pass down to you. Because every generation needs to rediscover the gospel. That's true. Every generation goes through this process of rediscovery. And every generation, so far, you could just click back a number of years and see this pattern happen. Every generation in their 20s and early 30s believe that they have stumbled upon the answer for all of Christendom. And if only we would listen to me, my 30-year-old self that has been on this planet less than, a very small amount of time, then we'll be able to lead ourselves into utopia. But every generation needs to go through this process of rediscovering the gospel, rediscovering the love and mystery of God, and every generation benefits from the historical church, from those people who have gone before you. And this is part of what I mean when I talk about taking my cues from Jesus. I want to be like Jesus. I want to think like Jesus. I want to be generous and kind. I am not naturally a generous person. Ask Sarah. I am not a generous person. People are like, can I have $5? I'm like, no. I want that $5 for a coffee. When? I don't know. I just want it for later. I'm not naturally a generous person. But I want to be like Jesus, which means I need to actually listen to what he says about money and generosity and living the good life through being kind and generous to others because I have been given the Spirit of God. I am not interested in theology for theology's sake. I'm not interested in being trapped in a consumeristic, Western, individualistic way to think about God. I need to be completely reformed. I need to learn from the diverse, marginalized voices that we have collected in our 66-book library that we call the Bible. I need to learn from my brown-skinned, traveling Jewish rabbi about what to believe about this world, about what to believe about God, what to believe about neighbor, what to believe about sexuality, money, about what to believe about the afterlife, about the here and now life, about forgiveness, about community. I need to learn from this Jesus because I know in my short time here, I don't have all the answers, Sway. I have no idea. I need to learn from Jesus, and I'm extremely cognizant of the reality that even when I think I'm learning from Jesus, my tendency is to gloss over the teachings that actually challenge me and make Jesus in my own image because I feel very comfortable in a theological system that is a mirror that affirms and looks exactly like me. So here's what I mean. If in our deconstruction, we find ourselves reconstructing theologies that fit really neatly with the Western, progressive, or conservative individualism that we've been handed, we've lost sight of right belief. I am suspicious of deconstruction projects, myself included, that end up looking like white liberalism or white conservatism. It means I have not actually deconstructed enough. Or, to be honest, that fit neatly into American politics at all. Because it seems like the way of Jesus does not fit squarely into any kind of a political system, and that's part of why it's difficult. Second, we have our second ortho. It is orthopraxy, or right practice. The early church, you read this in the book of Acts, the early church was called the Way, with a capital W, the Way. Because they truly believed that Jesus showed them the best possible way to live. And what we wanted to do was follow in the footsteps of Jesus. And the followers of Jesus actually meant that literally. They wanted to follow in the footsteps of Jesus. And this looked like surrendering all of yourself. Everything is His. Everything in my being, everything I own, everything I love, that is for you, Jesus. Because if I truly believe that Jesus resurrected from the dead, then that changes everything. It means that following the way might actually be a long process that is good for me, good for our communities, and that we can actually be the kinds of people that follow in the footsteps of Jesus. Following the way is to live out with your body what you believe in your theology. It's interesting that it's called the way and not the belief. It's called the way in the early church because they believed that your theology should flow into your practice. And so if you actually believe that Jesus rose from the dead, that changes all of your practice. It changes how you treat everything. Because if God is generous to you, then you can be generous to others. If God has given you every good and perfect thing, then your money, the privileges afforded to you, they're not yours. They are for pouring out onto other people, giving it away in love and delight. If God is fundamentally forgiving, then you get invited to forgive others. And when you don't forgive others, it shows that you might not know that this God is loving. If God is forgiving, it might mean with Jesus, you have a place to put your shame and your fear, and you get to give it to Jesus, because part of the orthopraxy, practicing the way, is reading the scriptures like Jesus, because he actually teaches us in the Gospels what it means to read the text faithfully. And for Jesus, faithfully meant walking the way of Jesus. The third ortho that the church has handed us is orthopathy, or right emotion. Orthopathy, or right emotion. This is one that Christians often forget, and so I'll put it like this. Part of following the way of Jesus is not just to believe the things that Jesus believed. It's not just to practice the things that Jesus practiced. It's to feel the way that Jesus felt. It's to feel like Jesus. To have your heart broken by injustice. To feel anger at abuse. To have your heart pained when you see that there is need that is unmet. To burst with joy at the reality that Jesus actually likes you, and to burst with heart at the reality that Jesus actually likes the person you hate. To be stirred towards love and affection for God, who is determined to love you. And so we can bring both of these things together. We can take the words of Jesus with justice, mercy, and faithfulness and actually overlay it pretty well over our orthodoxy, orthopraxy, and orthopathy. Because Jesus teaches us that all of these things are absolutely crucial and necessary for following the way of Jesus. Now, I want to do one more thing. Here is where I'd plot the Pharisees. The Pharisees loved their theology. They loved having the right doctrine, and they sincerely believed that they were working out their faith. But they completely neglected mercy. Their rules crushed people, and they refused to acknowledge it. I'd plot our fundamentalist brothers and sisters here. Closer to faithfulness, but still connected to mercy. They guard their theology and want to show some of the affections associated with following Jesus. I just think that by neglecting justice, they fall short of the way. And for our progressive brothers and sisters, I'd say they'd be squarely in between mercy and justice, because their hearts break for what breaks God's heart, and they are determined to fix it, come hell or high water. But what I'd argue is lacking is a commitment to faithfulness as Jesus would define it. Now, I recognize that I'm in some danger of plotting anything here. I don't think it's actually a good and helpful practice, but I'm trying to plot some movement so that we can have an understanding for what it looks like to follow Jesus. Because in the center of all of these things is the way. Or the way lived in loving and joyful submission to Jesus. It is the way of love. It is the way of freedom. It is the way of transformation. Both your heart, your mind, and your body. The way seeks the highest good for those around you. And the way seeks the highest good for you too. But to follow the way, we need to bring together faithfulness and justice and mercy. We cannot drop one of these things because it's inconvenient or because we want to overcorrect from the abuses that we've seen previous. That circle, that center point doesn't move. To follow the way is to bring together faithfulness and justice and mercy. A number of years later, the guy with the privileged adoptive background had made a life for himself. He started a small business, he got married, he joined a new family, but his faith was still in shambles. He believed that he had left behind his old life completely and deconstructed everything out of his system. He was pretty content as just kind of like a vague spiritualist, Gnostic. I don't really think about it, I'm just kind of moving forward, doing me. But one day, as he was heading to work, he noticed a bush next to him that caught fire, which wasn't all that unusual because in the desert, bushes catch fire all the time because it's hot in the desert. But the thing that was crazy about this was that this bush was not actually burning up. It just burned for like a weirdly long time. And so Moses stopped to watch this burning bush, and he was like, when's it going to go? And then all of a sudden, he heard God speak, Moses. This God knew his name. This shook Moses' entire world. That's not how God's acted. That's not what his theological system would allow for. His entire theological system was based around Egyptian territorial gods, which were violent, which were vengeful, which had to be pleased and nourished. That was like his entire theological system. But this God sounded a lot like those rumors he heard of the God of his ancestors, the God who seeks people out, who calls people out of their culture and their background and wherever they're at, and who meets them in the desert, even if they are running. And God tells Moses his own name. God identifies himself as Yahweh. There's no guessing games with Yahweh. Moses does not have to figure out which God is speaking. He's not going, do I add you to these other gods? How do I understand this? And God goes, I am the only one. I am the one who is speaking to you. I am the one who will lead you back to your people because they need to be liberated from the violence and oppression of Pharaoh. And so Moses actually goes back. He's terrified. He argues with God for a while, which kind of goes well, actually, for him. That's some of the weirdness of the Old Testament. You have these mysteries of things that happen. And Moses argues, and God's like, all right, fine, I'll send a friend with you. And so he goes back. But here's what I want to point out. Have you noticed that the 10 plagues, they may not be just for Pharaoh? The 10 plagues that God sends down on Egypt, I'd argue, is God reconstructing Moses' theological system. And then the Ten Commandments, which come several chapters later, is God deconstructing and reconstructing the Israel theological system, because no more is their God going to be characterized by violence and oppression, and it's going to be characterized by a God who will stay with them no matter what. This is the God who rules over the Egyptian gods. Perhaps God is okay with deconstruction and reconstruction. So for those of us here who are starting or in the middle of your deconstruction journey, I have two things for you. First, it takes a tremendous amount of courage to re-examine your belief system, no matter where you're coming from. And you may be in a place where you feel spiritually lost, destitute. You're in the desert. You're like a balloon in a tornado. You're just trying to hang on. And if you haven't found the end of your free fall yet, God's tenderness and patience and presence is here for you. He meets Moses in the desert. And Moses slowed down long enough to see the bush wasn't burning up. I love the way that African Bishop Augustine puts it. He says, God loves each one of us as if there were only one of us. Isn't that great? God loves each one of us as if there were only one of us. In the midst of your strongest deconstruction, your hardest pushback against God, which I've always argued He can take it. Christianity is never and has never been the religion that cannot take the hard questions. Some of the earliest documents from our faith are those people dealing and wrestling with those questions. So in the midst of your hardest questions, your hardest pushback against God, God is here with you. Jesus is near you in His faithfulness and tenderness towards you. He brings justice on your behalf, and His mercy and understanding is here for you. God is not tapping His foot in disappointment towards you. God is the one who seeks you out in the desert. The second thing I'd say, I don't have a stat because the studies have not been produced yet. But I'd bet that like 90% of deconstruction journeys begin with deep, deep wounding. Whether it's from the church, from a family, from a close friend, disappointment, loss, feeling abandoned. The fact that you bear this wound, it breaks God's heart. Not that you're sad, not that you have the wound, but the fact that you bear this wound, it breaks God's heart. And I know some of you are graduating in a short few weeks. And my pastoral, and it's like incredible, I love it. You guys have done incredible work. But I know that for many Judson graduates, for many college graduates, they graduate and they feel absolutely abandoned by God. And I watch student after student deconstruct. And my heart breaks because I go, God is actually near you in that process. And He cares about the wound that you bear. He cares about the fact that you feel isolated and alone. And you know exactly what that feels like. You are the generation that navigated through the pandemic. Some of you did not feel God's closeness. Some of you felt the church's scorn. I am so sorry for that. I genuinely am. The fact that you bear these wounds, that you have these wounds, it breaks God's heart. So here's my prayer for those of us in this room who are deconstructing, reconstructing, or constructing for the first time. Or friends who are just totally unsure where they are in the entire process. May you know that God is with you even in the desert. May you feel the freedom to ask hard questions and bring them into the presence of Jesus. May you find a community of people that support you and love you and are with you in the questions. May you see that the way of Jesus is a life that is full and complete. And may you know in your bones that God loves you as if you were the only one. Thank you all for your time. I love you all. Have a good rest of your day.